Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to part 3 of our History of Halacha in Bayit Sheni series entitled A Way Apart, the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. So far, we've set the background by outlining the various groups that were around in the first few centuries of the Common Era and what their beliefs were. We explained what sources we had for our knowledge of the time, and then we honed in on Jesus' teachings, his perhaps revolutionary attitude towards Rome, as well as Paul and the spread of Christianity after Jesus. All of this drove us towards our fundamental question, which was when and why did a Jewish sect of Nazarenes, meaning the people who followed Jesus of Nazareth, when and how did those people who were all Jews suddenly stop being Jewish? To put it better, how halachically could a Jewish group at the time become a goy for the purposes of things like minyan or yayin nesech and the like? What we found was that the basic answer to our question is you can't. There doesn't seem to be a historical halachic precedent for a Jewish group doing something that transforms them into a non Jewish group, to the extent that even the Samaritans, who were not really a Jewish group to begin with, were considered for some halachic purposes as if they were Jews. Yiddishkeit is like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can't ever leave. Which takes us to this week. Now, we start to explore various historical events, which individually could not be seen as creating that schism between Jews and Christians, but adding them all up can perhaps collectively point us in the right direction. We touch on things like the various wars between the Jews and Rome, the malediction of the heretics, the Jewish tax, Fiscus Judaicus, the Christians changing their calendar to move Sabbath to Sunday, and much more. Some of these events had a more direct impact on whether the average Stam Jew in the first few decades of the second century viewed Jewish Christians as Jewish or as Christian. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, major points of demarcation. Previously on A Way Apart, the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, we came to the conclusion that we haven't seen anything in the doctrine of early Christianity which would have justified putting it out of the realm of acceptable beliefs in ancient Judaism. And when we compared it to other groups who were ostensibly in, or at least partially in, we came to the conclusion that once a Jew, pretty much always a Jew. Yisrael, afal pi shechata, Yisrael hu, right? A Jew, even if they sin, and here sin can include holding heretical beliefs or beliefs that are outside of the mainstream of Pharisaic and rabbinic Judaism, that doesn't change you or take you out of the fact that you are a halachic Jew. Again, let me be clear, modern day Christianity is not compatible in any way, shape, or form with modern day Judaism. It is verboten. We are discussing ancient history only. Okay, back to our story. In the absence of concrete halachic statements from Chazal, which classify Jewish Christians as goyim, we enter the realm of speculation. I don't think any single item that we're going to discuss can be painted as the trigger, but together they collectively add up. Here are what scholars view as some of the most credible candidates for generating that schism. First, let's start with a little bit more background. Rome took over Judea, or what we're going to call Eretz Yisrael, in approximately the year 63 before the Common Era. That's Pompey. After some, let's say, less than from Jewish rulers who were appointed by Rome, around the year 6 of the Common Era, the Jews who made up anywhere from 10 to, from what I've seen, according to some estimates, nearly 20% of the population of the Roman Empire, that's in Judea and outside of Judea in places like Alexandria and Rome, who's had a consistent Jewish presence for thousands of years, they began to revolt in Judea. This was the beginning of the on again, off again formal pushback against Roman rule. We can't really blame the Jews either because the Roman emperors tried to do things like, I don't know, put a statue of themselves in the Beis HaMikdash, and I think at some point they succeeded in sticking an eagle up there. Anyway, officially the fighting broke out into war starting around, let's say, the 60s of the Common Era, and again, um, around, I think it's like 115 to 118 was the Kitos War, and then finally during the Bar Kokhba revolts of the 130s. But here's the major point. The Jews were never completely exiled from Eretz Yisrael, even after the destruction of the temple, and after all of these wars, we were not permitted to go to Yerushalayim. That became Ilia Capitolina, and the Jews are kicked out of Yerushalayim. But the Chachamim moved to Yavne and Caesarea and the entire Mishnah and Tosefta and the Yerushalmi, which is in and of itself a misnomer. But if I called it the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, instead, you'd probably look at me funny. Anyway, they were all composed after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, but while we were still in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so now we've got all that in mind, let's take a closer look at how Chazal reacted to some of these events to see if it can help us find historical demarcations. The first and most important event is the destruction of the temple. That's starting in the year 64 and culminating with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash in 70 of the Common Era. This event would not have caused a schism uh, in and of itself with the nascent Christian movement, who definitely did not support the Jewish revolt, but it is a watershed period wherein the rabbis ascended to prominence and the Essenes and the Sadducees basically disappear. That makes sense because the Sadducees, their whole thing revolves around being in charge of the temple, right? So there was no contingency plan to fall back on, and we're going to get into more of that shortly. But more importantly for us, the newfound rabbinic caucus at Yavne leads to many innovations, including one that I want to focus on first, and that is Birkat Haminim. I'm going to put the actual image of an early version of this, we'll call it quote unquote blessing, in the show notes. This basically comes from the Cairo Geniza and is dated to around, let's say, the 800s. But it seems to be basically the same as the text that we have from the Yerushalmi, which is hundreds of years earlier. Ruth Langer has a whole book on this and has tracked down all the different variants. The basic background is that I think everyone knows our Shmona Esrei, which literally means 18, has in fact 19 blessings. The text of that 19th bracha from the Cairo Geniza reads as follows. I'm just going to give it to you in English, and then we'll do the Hebrew. For the apostates, there should be no hope, and the evil empire should be uprooted in our day, and the Notzrim, meaning here I'm editorializing the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, and the sectarians should be instantly destroyed, erased from the book of life, and not written with the righteous. We're going to skip the parentheses. Blessed are you, Hashem, who brings down or subdues the evil. LeMishumadim, al tihi tikva malchus zadum mehera ta'aker b'yamenu, v'hanotzrim v'hamin kereg yovedu, yimachu misefer ha'chaim v'im hatzadikim al yikasevu baruch Hashem machnia zedim. Okay, let's talk Birkas Haminim, what we should really term the malediction of the heretics or the sectarians. Unclear exactly when this, again, quote unquote, blessing was written. Probably at the end of the first century, it was of the Common Era, is when we get this story with Shmuel HaKatan. That's in a Gemara in Brachos, where it seems to me that he's really establishing or reestablishing the correct nusach of the bracha, the correct language and the text that's going to be continually used, but not necessarily establishing the existence of the bracha. Um, that was really much older. So it doesn't seem from the Gemara there that Shmuel HaKatan is composing the bracha. And I urge you to see that Gemara in Brachos inside, and I'll give you the exact location in the show notes. But the idea there is that Shmuel HaKatan arranges the bracha. He ends up the next time that he is leading the tefillah, he forgets it, and they wait for several hours for him to recall it. And then there's a question: why did they allow him to do that? Why didn't they just assume that he was a heretic, and he gets special dispensation because he's the one that had arranged it in the first place? We do have a lot of cool evidence that it's much older. So first of all, we can trace the Shemona Esrei to, at the very least, 200 before the Common Era, and we do that both by dating the time period of Shimon HaTzadik. So Shemona Esrei is established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. The one of the last people, or the people who were part of the Shari Knesset Hagdolah, the remnant of the end of that group, it was Shimon HaTzadik, who dates to around 200 before the Common Era. We also have evidence of the existence of the Shemona Esrei in Ben Sira, chapter 36, which is also around 200 of the Common Era. But what's more interesting for this bracha specifically is that we seem to have allusions to it in, first of all, in the Gospel of John. That's John 9:22, 12:42, and 16:2. I'll read those inside just kind of briefly in the English. So John chapter 9, starting in verse 20, there's this whole question about a miracle that was performed, and the parents are, well, okay, I'll read the whole thing. They still don't believe. that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked him. Is this the one you said that was born blind? How is it that he can now see? Right? Jesus performed this miracle, and the person who was blind can now see. We know he's our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said this. This is verse 22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. That's verse 23. So the idea here is that there is tension between the Jewish leaders, as it says in the verse over there, and putting people out of the synagogue. Remember, this doesn't mean taking them out of Yiddishkeit. This is just saying they're not allowed to be in shul. And the question would be, why? Why is that the case? And the implied assumption over here is that it has something to do with calling attention to the Notzrim in the prayer of Shemona Esrei. We get the same thing in John chapter 12. In verse 42, it says, Yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him being Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for the fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. So, same idea. And we get that again in John 16, starting the first verse. All this I have told you so that you will not fall away. Verse 2, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think that they are offering a service to God. So, again, three times in the Gospel of John do we see this idea that people are afraid, Jewish Christians are afraid of being put out of the synagogue because of their belief in Jesus. And the idea is that the source for this would be that Birkan Haminim. If a Shmuel Hakatan is composing or arranging this blessing around the end of the first century of the Common Era, and then we see that the effect is showing up immediately in the Gospel of John, also end of the first century, beginning of the second century of the Common Era. We're sort of making an assumption, but trying to connect the dots here a little bit, that the reason they're afraid of being put out of the synagogue is because of this Birkas Haminim and the intent over here. According to Chazal, the way this worked was essentially sniffing out heretics who would refuse to lead the congregation and curse themselves, because they would have to say that Mishumadim and the Notzrim should be Kerega Yovedu and Yimachu, they should be wiped out, and etc. People who the assumption is people who believe in Jesus don't want to say that, and then they're identified as being part of the Jesus movement and are excluded from the synagogue, because again we're starting to see that schism, that breakdown, where Stam Jews are not considering Jewish Christians to be Jewish. Adele Reinhartz, just for the sake of completion, she sees the Book of John and the letters as a formulation of a separate kind of community which removes itself from Judaism. To me, that's kind of surprising, since the whole religion of Christianity, especially from Paul, was about inclusion. This also kind of sounds like the Essenes playbook to me. I'm just going to leave that to the side. Okay, everything up until now has been kind of beating around the bush. So the Jews have this bracha and Shemona Esrei calling out the Notzrim, and John seems to tell us that the Jewish Christians were kind of worried about being thrown out of shul. But how do we know that this bracha was the reason and was seen as a direct attack? Enter Justin Martyr, right? If you recall Justin Martyr with his dialogue with Trypho, we said that's Tarphone. Justin Martyr in his dialogue actually says that the Jews cursed the Christians in their prayer. That's in chapter 16. Let's see if we can find that and read a little bit for you inside. For you are not recognized amongst the rest of men by any other mark other than your fleshly circumcision. For none of you, I suppose, will venture to say that God neither did nor does foresee the events which are future. Yada yada. Here we go. And now you reject those who hope for him meaning Jesus, and in him who sent him, that's God, God Almighty and the maker of all things, cursing in your synagogue those that believe in Christ. That's Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, chapter 16. And again, in chapter 96, we have the same idea. And while neither they nor you are persuaded by us, but strive earnestly to cause us to deny the name of Christ, who choose rather and submit to death in the full assurance that all the good which God promises us through Christ, he will reward us, etc. Where's this? Hold on one second. Okay, I was a little too far down. For the statement in the law, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree, confirms our hope, which depends on the crucified Christ, not because he who had been crucified is cursed by God, but because God foretold, etc. For you, here's the part that we want. For you, curse in your synagogues all those who are called from him. Christians and other nations effectively carry out the curse, putting to death those who simply confess themselves to be Christians. The idea here, again, is that in Shul, you Jews are cursing the Christians, and the assumption here, of course, is that that curse is the Birkat Haminim. So Justin Trifo is writing no later than, let's say, 160 of the Common Era. We don't really have enough direct evidence to call this a quote-unquote demarcation, right? This isn't the one and only thing that we can point to and say, okay, now Jews really see Jews really see Jewish Christians as something that is halachically not Jewish, but it's the beginning of Jews starting to draw lines between themselves and Christians. The next topic we need to explore is the disappearance of the Sadducees, and I mentioned that before. Here's a $64,000 question. Why did the Sadducees disappear? No one's really sure. Standard hypothesis is their influence was tied to the temple and the priesthood because most of the tzaddukim were priests or were associated with the priesthood and the Beis HaMikdash and the aristocratic group that was in power because of their connection to the Beis HaMikdash. And so no temple, poof, no Sadducees. To me, that seems a little too simplistic. What about the Essenes and all the other groups? We really stopped hearing about all these different denominations after the Chorban Habayit. What I'll offer you is, what if no temple really equals more rabbinic power and the ability to start cutting out sectarians? Meaning, it's not just the Notzrim that the rabbis are writing out. Once the locus of power has shifted from the temple to Torah scholarship, which is itself a huge thing that I don't think scholars really understand or explore enough, but once we turn the Beis Medrash into the portable Mikdash and make learning rather than Korbanos and Avoda the way to connect to Hashem, so ipso facto the scholars could, with impunity, decide who or what was in or out. I think that's part of what contributes to the tzaddukim being out. It contributes to the eventual ability to write out the notes room as well. And it leads us into the next sort of major demarcation or historical event, and that's the next topic, which is canonization. As a brief recap, the most comprehensive work I know on canonization is still Dr. Schneur Lyman's work, even if basically no one agrees on his conclusions. The reason canonization is important, and here what I mean by canonization is deciding which books are part of Tanakh and which books are not, um, because it helps you to identify, like, let's say the Gospels as being not only not part of Tanakh, but things that we can start to call Sifrei Minim, books of the heretics or the sectarians, or books of people who are not fully part of Yiddishkeit. Like, it doesn't matter that Homer was a pagan, his work is not Sifrei Minim. It doesn't seem that this was a one-time, get everybody together in Usha and suddenly you have an agreed upon canon type of an event. There's discussion, as we've seen in other contexts regarding Shir Shirim, as to what is in and what is out. The point is that if I can point to texts which I have identified halachically as being not part of the world of Stam Judaism, then it's an easy next step to say anyone who reads those texts or is otherwise associated with those works, like, say, they quote them, is either out of bounds or at the very least we kind of look at them askance. There's some great references in the Gemara in Shabbos 116a to the writing of the Gospels. We have Rabbi Meir have karile avon gilion, and Rabbi Yochanan have karile avon gilion. Rabbi Meir would call the Christian writing the evangelical writing that we talked about, which is the Gospels. He would make a pun and call it the wicked folio, avon and Rabbi Yochanan called it the sinful folio, avon gilion. The Tosefta in Yadayim is really valuable here for us This again separates out heretical beliefs while not casting out the believers themselves. The Tosefta says as follows: Hagilyonim, the Sifrei Haminim. So this is the evangelical writing, and the Sifrei Minim, we're kind of equating the two. Einam Tamas Hayadayim, Sifrei Ben Sira, V'chos Farm Shenichtavu Mikam Ve'elach, Einam Tamim Es Hayadayim. Okay. Then it gets even more interesting when we get to the Tosefta in Chulin. That's Parak Beis and Mishnayos 20 through 24 in the Tosefta over there. I'm going to read these all to you, and I want you to tell me if this is the breaking point. Are they in or are they out? Let's pull this up. Okay, so we start with 20. Basar shenimsa b'yad guy. If you have meat in the hands of a guy, mutter bahana b'yad hamin. And remember, we mentioned last time that there's a question whether the terminology min, maybe it refers to Sadducees. Over here, it seems pretty clear from the continuation that that min actually refers to the Notzrim. So you have basar in the hands of a min, asr bahana, it's forbidden to have any hana from it. Hayotzim beis avodah zara, hareza basar zovche mesim, b'nei she'amru, because they said shchitas hamin, the shechting of a min is avodah zara. Pitan, the pas of the min, is pat kuti, v'yenam yayin nesech, uperosehem tvolim. Their fruits are considered tevel, they haven't been tithed. The sifreim sifrei kosmin, and their books are books of incantations and magic. There's a whole discipline or area of research where Chazal have kind of portrayed Jesus as this kind of magician, and it comes out very extensively in this work called Todos Yeshu, which I believe is like from the Gaonic period, and it casts Jesus as a magician. We're going to see a little bit more of that actually in the Tosefta when people are quoting incantations in his name. Ubnehem, and the children of these minim are mamzerim. In mochrin lehem, ve'in lochem mehem, you can't do any sort of business buying or selling with them. Ve'in nosin mehem, ve'in nosin lahem, ve'in melamdanis benehem umnus, you can't teach their kids any sort of trade. Ve'in misrathim mehem, you can't be healed by any of them. Lo ripui mamam v'lo ripui nefashos, not for pay and not even to save a life. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Ashrecha ben Dama. I'm sorry, I skipped one. Let's see why it's not going to 22. Give me 1 second. Okay, we got Al HaTorah working again. Maisa Rabbi Elazar ben Dama. There's this story with Rabbi Elazar ben Dama, and I have theorized on this and not seen any sort of corroboration. There is a story in the Gemara that we've seen in other contexts when we had the retelling of Tanakh in Chazal. There's a righteous Gentile whose name is Dama ben Nesina. And here we have this Rabbi Elazar ben Dama. So Dama doesn't seem to be a Jewish name, and I'm curious if Rabbi Elazar ben Dama is Rabbi Elazar's father is that same Dama ben Nesina who had the story with the Kibbud Av Va'em and not taking the stone, whatever. Not to get too far afield. Okay, so anyway, there's this story with Rabbi Elazar ben Dama, Shenashcho Nachash, that he's bit by a snake, Rabbi Elazar. Uba Yaakov ish kfar sama l'rafoso, and this man Yaakov from the town of Sama comes to heal him. Mishum Yeshu ben Pantera, in the name of Yeshua, the son of Pantera. The assumption here, we're not going to get into the whole discussion of whether the Jesus that we're referencing here is the same Yeshu as Jesus. We're just going to assume that it is this Pantera, the son of a panther. There's the whole discussion, and it's not really our sugya of Jesus being born to either a Roman soldier, and that's what Pantera is, or sort of a nickname as being the son of a panther, whatever it is. But the idea here is that this Rabbi Elazar is bit by a snake. He's dying from the venom of the snake, and Yaakov, who is a student or a healer, comes to use some sort of incantation from Yeshu, from Jesus, in order to heal him. V'lo hinichu Rabbi Shmuel. And Rabbi Shmuel refuses to let Yaakov heal Rabbi Lazar. Amru lo yata rashai ben dama. You're not allowed to ben dama. This is referring to Rabbi Lazar. Amar lo, he says to him, Rabbi Lazar, the assumption here says to him, Ani avi lacha raya sheyirapenu. So I'm going to bring you a raya that I'm allowed to let this Yaakov heal me, even in the name of Yeshu. Well, he speak lahavi raya, but he didn't have enough of an opportunity. There wasn't enough time ad shemes until he dies, and then Amar Rebbe Lazar, this is the last mission in the Tosefta. Ashracha ben Damash, Yatza b'Shalom, v'lo paratzta g'deran shel chachamim. How lucky are you, Ben Dama, that you expired, that he, right, Ben Dama, Rebbe Lazar over here dies because of this snake bite. It's better that you allowed yourself to die and not be healed through the incantation of someone in the name of Yeshu. Shekol, because v'lo paratzta g'deran shel chachamim, you didn't break the fence of the Chachamim, and there's a little bit of irony in this whole statement. Shekol apart g'derin shel Chachamim lasof puranas balav, because anyone who breaks the boundary of the Chachamim, bad things are going to occur to such a person. Shenemar uparitz geder yishchenu nachash, that if a person breaks down, this is the pasuk from Koheles, a person breaks down a boundary is going to get bit by a snake. There's definitely some sort of irony in all of this, because he did get bit by a snake, and the perennials did happen to him. He died, right? The assumption here is that had he allowed this to happen, it would have affected his olam haba, whatever the case may be. But the takeaway for us from all these statements in the Tosefta is, do we see from this discussion that Christians or people who seem to be followers of Yeshu, are they considered goyim? Are they not considered goyim? Well, we said their kids are mamzerim. Okay, well, someone who is not a Jew, someone who's a goy, their kids are not mamzerim, their kids are goyim. Um, but by the same token, it does seem that to a certain extent that they are outside of Yiddishkeit. So I think it still leaves us with not 100% a clear demarcation, but we're starting to see more and more that there's an intentional identification with the Jewish Christians as other. They're not necessarily not Jewish, but they're not necessarily completely Jewish either. Another area that we need to pay attention to is Roman law. Remember, we saw Tacitus recording the difference between Jews and Christians. Well, some of those differences become Roman law after the First War. Who does Rome start to persecute and force to pay the Jewish tax? That's the Fiscus Judaicus. That tax only applies to Jews and not Christians. By the year 96, it was clear to Rome that Christians were not Jews, and thus they didn't have to pay the tax. So that's not a halacha category, but it makes it easier to identify who's who. If you don't have to pay the tax, do we really trust your kashrus? I'll read to you a little bit from an article in Biblical Archaeology. He says as follows: Dominion Nerva immediately set out about reforming the administration of the Fiscus Judaicus, even issuing a coin celebrating the reform. The essential part of the reform was to redefine Judaism as a religion. Indeed, this is how Cassius Dio depicts the Fiscus Judaicus, the tax that was imposed upon Jews who continued to, quote unquote, observe their ancestral customs. So now Jews are not a people, they're a religion. This reflects Nerva's reform, argues Mistra, I don't know what that is. Christianity was now seen by the Romans as not Judaism. The Fiscus Judaicus applied neither to Gentile Christians nor to Jewish Christians. Within a few years, Christians would be persecuted as Christians, yada yada. Okay, I think that gets us too far afield. But the point over here is that you can tell as a Jew or as a Christian which side of the line you're on based on your tax filings. I think things get even clearer by the time of Shimon Bar Kosiba. The Christians did not participate in the Bar Kokhba revolts of the 130s. Well, why not? For one thing, at least according to Rabbi Akiva and probably others, Bar Kokhba was seen as a potential messianic figure. Though it's not clear if Bar Kokhba himself held that way, but from the Christian perspective, since their Messiah came already, i.e., even if, as Rabbi Dr. Ari Lam argues, neither Bar Kokhba nor the Christians saw him as a messianic figure, still, he was essentially the king of the Jews and wasn't Jesus. So they seem to have opted not to support him, which drove a cultural wedge. In fact, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamb offers a whole contrarian position to understanding all of this. He seems to rely more on when Christians writ large saw themselves as a different faith community, which wasn't until officially the First Council of Nicaea, that's 325. There are a bevy of other events that we could point to, including Stam Christians kicking out Jewish Christians sometime after 325 and before the year 500. That seems far too late for me to believe that there wasn't already some sort of real halachic divide. Another thing is changing the calendar. That happens in stages, like moving Shabbos to Sunday in the second century. But I think still we're going to rely on the biggest milestone being the Council of Nicaea. So, just to recap for us what we've seen so far, I think we can start pointing to all of the different important events that happened from the destruction of the temple through the Roman wars of Bar Kokhba as being additive, meaning you have the Birkas Haminim, you have um, the Christians recognizing that the Jews are treating them differently. You have the rabbis having more and more power to write certain groups out of Yiddishkeit, and then you have on top of that Romans treating Jews and Christians as different. All of these things start to add up to the point where I think by the end of the 130s, meaning after the Bar Kokhba revolt, after Jews are no longer allowed to be in Yerushalayim, but Christians are allowed to go to Ilia Capitolina. All of those things start to pile up to a point where the average Jew living in the second century has a very clear understanding that the Jewish Christian is different. Now, the Okay, let's talk key takeaways. As per Sanders, E.P. Sanders, it appears correct to say that it was the assumed standard, call it Pharisaic standard position in Second Temple Judaism that once you're in, i.e., you're part of the Jewish nation, there's almost no way to be kicked out. What he calls covenantal nomism. Perhaps that's because being a Jew leads to Olam Haba, or perhaps it's because you're now in a covenant with Hashem. Whatever the case is, it's pretty darn hard to kick out people like the Sadducees, and it took their way of thinking to essentially die out after the Chorban to really get rid of them. With Christians, it likewise took them kicking out Christian Jews and a bunch of other stuff to 100% get them out of the fold. That being the case, and in the absence of a single authoritarian body that could draw a line in the sand and have every Jewish community follow their psak, it seems that Christians had to be bred out. Meaning, that while it was true for a few generations that you had Jewish Christians who were born from Jewish women, as the number of Stam Christians increased, remember that was Paul's whole thing, is bringing in the pagans and quasi converting them, but not really halachically converting them. So you have all of these essentially non-Jews who are now part of the Christian group. So as those numbers increased, so did the likelihood that a Jewish Christian would marry a Stam Christian woman and have a child who, from a rabbinic perspective, wasn't actually Jewish at all. In the end, Christianity doesn't stop being Jewish on purpose, it stops being Jewish by accident of birth. So, what's our conclusion? As with most, or maybe all historical developments, it's hard to point to a singular event or line in the sand where things changed. It seems that this was a gradual process wherein we can confidently assign a terminus ad quem to the mid 4th century. The various demarcations we've considered all played important roles, and weird as it may seem, it's possible to imagine halacha being different for different people and in different places. For example, in Israel in the year 100 of the Common Era, Jewish Christians could have been seen as still Jewish, and not so in the year 200, whereas in the year 200 outside Israel, it's possible that they were only beginning to note and write out these fringe co-religionists while having already assigned Christianity a status as an independent religion. To me, it helps to think of it as in earlier attempts we would look at a standard synchronous Jew, meaning Yankee keeps Shabbos and Kashrus and all the rest, but he also has like this effigy of Baal or Asher or whatever. Does that make Yankee a guy? Probably not, right? Now, if Yankee marries Christine, that kid, if probably not Jewish, and I would is probably not Jewish, and I would probably treat Yankee's wine as kind of suspect at that point, but I would still have to treat him as halachically a Jew. My best guess at what happened is that as Jewish Christians married Stam Christians, their kids were halachically goyim within a few generations. This whole thing was pretty moot, even if there was an extended period of murkiness. The thing about which scares me, what does this really mean for some of the denominations of Judaism today, where we place a huge emphasis on creed and not just deed, meaning now in the 21st century? Let's talk some real practical ramifications. There are large swaths of Jewish denominations today, especially in America, who embrace positions theologically and halachically which place them out of bounds of normative, orthodox, halachic Judaism of both today and even really going back 2,000 years. If history is any guide, and you don't need to go back to Jesus, you can see the exact same thing play out after the Sabbatian debacle, but the result in the end is always the same. Faster or slower, within a couple of hundred years, those sects, groups, denominations, whatever you want to call them, are simply lost to the Jewish people. The amazing thing is, it's not because they were cast out. Sure, the halacha is firmed up as a result of the creation of these new groups, but in the end, while you can't point to a single position that causes them to lose their status as Jews, the fact is, it would be ludicrous to argue today that Christians are Jews. And it would be likewise crazy to close our eyes and assume that it won't happen to Achenu B'nai Yisrael, who are this very day slipping away from us. Perhaps one of the things we can learn from Second Temple period is their ability to live with and serve with one another. The ability to do so is what kept the Beis HaMikdash going for hundreds of years. You have people who are hashkafically at complete different ends of the earth, and yet they can work together and serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu together. Part of that breakdown is what causes the destruction. May Hashem bless us all to see all of his children return to him fully and merit the real Yemos Mashiach b'mher b'yameinu. Amen. This is the end, beautiful friend. Thank you for joining us on our journey of learning, and I hope you will tune in for another episode soon, Mirz Hashem. Be well.